She came into my life like a storm, wild, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. I didn't see her coming. One moment my world was calm, predictable, and neatly arranged. The next it was chaos, a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't contain. And the strangest part? I didn't want to contain them. The day I met her was unremarkable at first. A gray sky hung overhead, the kind of weather that made you keep your head down and your pace quick. But she wasn't the type to blend into the background. She moved with purpose, her energy radiating in a way that seemed to defy the dreary day. I remember the first thing she said to me. It wasn't rehearsed or delicate. It was raw, spontaneous, and perfectly her. Something about needing help, or maybe a question she'd already forgotten she asked. It wasn't the words that struck me, but the way she said them, like she was completely unafraid of the world around her. In that instant, I was drawn to her, though I couldn't explain why. She wasn't like anyone I'd ever met before, bold in a way that made me question my own quiet existence. It felt as though she had arrived not just into my life, but into my very soul, pulling apart the threads of everything I thought I knew. If I had known then how much she would change me, would I have stepped into the storm? I still don't know the answer, but I do know one thing. From the moment she entered my life, I never wanted the calm again. Before she came along, my life was steady, comfortably predictable, if not entirely fulfilling. I woke up at the same time every morning, brewed my coffee just the way I liked it, and went about my day with a quiet routine that felt safe. I had convinced myself that this calm, orderly existence was all I needed. I wasn't unhappy exactly, but I wasn't alive in the way she was. My world was structured, efficient, and completely untouched by the wild energy of spontaneity. I avoided risk, preferring the certainty of my carefully laid plans over the chaos of the unknown. Relationships for me had always been logical, measured, deliberate, and ultimately fleeting. So when she stormed into my life, she brought with her something I hadn't realized I was missing. She was fire to my ice, a force of nature that didn't ask permission to exist. At first, I told myself that her energy was just a passing fascination, something I'd admire from a distance. But the truth was she was already pulling me in, and my neatly constructed life began to feel impossibly small. She didn't fit into the safe, tidy box I had built for myself. She was unpredictable, full of contradictions, and gloriously unapologetic about it. Where I sought calm, she embraced chaos. Where I followed the rules, she wrote her own. It terrified me how quickly she became a presence I couldn't ignore. But it also intrigued me. She didn't just disrupt my life, she challenged it, forcing me to see everything differently. And deep down, I think I knew that there was no going back to the calm I once clung to. I didn't realize it at the time, but meeting her was the first step in a journey I never knew I needed. A journey into the storm that would redefine everything I thought I understood about love, life, and myself. The day she entered my life wasn't extraordinary by any measure, at least not until she made it that way. It was a gray afternoon, the kind where the air hangs heavy with the promise of rain. I was sitting in my favorite cafe, nursing a cup of black coffee and thumbing through emails on my phone. Just another day in my quiet, orderly routine. Then out of nowhere, she was there. Not with a polite hello or a gentle introduction, but with an energy that seemed to electrify the room. She wasn't loud or overbearing, nothing like that, but there was something about her presence that demanded attention. She carried herself as though the world was hers to mold, and she wasn't afraid to make it happen. "Hey, do you mind if I sit here?" she asked, her voice tinged with an easy confidence that caught me off guard. I glanced up, startled. The cafe wasn't crowded, and there were other empty tables. Sure," I managed, motioning to the chair across from me. She plopped down without hesitation, setting her bag on the floor and a journal on the table. For a moment, she didn't say anything, scribbling something furiously in her notebook while I sat frozen, unsure of what to do. I wasn't used to this, having a stranger invade my space so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then she looked up and caught me staring. Her eyes, bright, intense, and full of mischief, seemed to spark with amusement. "Don't worry, I won't bother you long," she said, a playful grin tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I just need to escape the monotony of my own thoughts for a bit." Her words caught me off guard, disarming me in a way I couldn't explain. Who was this person who spoke with such ease, who didn't hesitate to lay herself bare in a single sentence. I tried to respond, but all I could manage was a faint, "Oh, sure, no problem." She laughed then, a warm, unrestrained sound that felt like sunshine cutting through the overcast day. "You're not much of a talker, are you?" she teased. But there was no malice in her words, only curiosity. I felt my cheeks flush, embarrassed by how much she had unsettled me in mere minutes. "Not usually," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. "Well, lucky for you, I'm great at filling silences," she said, leaning back in her chair as though she had all the time in the world. And she did. For the next 20 minutes, she spoke with a kind of reckless honesty that left me captivated. She told me about her day, about a project she was working on, and even a random story about a stray dog she'd tried to rescue the week before. It wasn't what she said that mesmerized me. It was the way she said it, with an unfiltered passion that made even the mundane feel extraordinary. By the time she stood to leave, I realized I hadn't checked my phone once. She gathered her things, slinging her bag over her shoulder with the same effortless confidence she'd brought into the room. "Thanks for letting me share your table," she said, her tone light, as though she hadn't just upended my perfectly calm day. And then she was gone, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of her perfume and the unmistakable feeling that my life had just been altered in ways I couldn't yet understand. After that day, I couldn't get her out of my mind. It wasn't just her presence or her words, it was the way she made me feel, like I had been jolted awake from a long, dull slumber. I didn't expect to see her again, but life had other plans. Our paths crossed again a week later. This time it was at a bookstore, tucked between shelves of worn paperbacks and freshly minted novels. She was standing in the poetry section, flipping through a book with the same intensity she had scribbled into her notebook at the cafe. For a moment I hesitated, unsure if I should approach her. Then, as if sensing my presence, she turned and met my eyes. A slow, mischievous smile spread across her face. "Well, if it isn't the quiet guy from the cafe," she said, her voice lilting with humor. "Didn't expect to find you lurking in the poetry aisle." I managed a sheepish laugh, my earlier hesitation dissolving under her disarming gaze. "I could say the same about you," I replied, surprising myself with how easily the words came out. From there, our conversation flowed effortlessly, as though we had known each other for years. She told me how she loved poetry for its ability to capture raw emotion in so few words, and I found myself admitting that I rarely read it, preferring the structured logic of nonfiction. She laughed at that, a sound that was becoming familiar and strangely comforting. "You need a little chaos in your reading list," she said, holding out the book she'd been flipping through. "Here, start with this." That marked the beginning of what I can only describe as a whirlwind. She had a way of drawing me into her world, one vibrant, unpredictable moment at a time. It wasn't just her words that captivated me, it was her spirit. She approached life with an intensity I had never dared to match, embracing every experience with open arms. We began spending more time together, though I wasn't entirely sure how it happened. She would invite me to join her on impromptu adventures, a late-night drive to watch the stars, a spontaneous hike on a rainy day, or even just an afternoon spent people-watching at the park. Each moment felt like a challenge to the quiet, predictable life I had built, and with every challenge, I found myself leaning in rather than pulling away. She was the storm I hadn't known I needed, and I was the calm she never tried to tame. Together we were a contradiction, a balance of chaos and order that somehow worked. But falling into her world wasn't without its moments of uncertainty. There were times when I questioned if I could keep up with her, if I could truly be the person she needed. And yet, every time I doubted myself, she had a way of grounding me with a single look or a few well-placed words. "You don't have to match me," she said once after I admitted my fears. "You just have to be here, that's enough." Her words settled over me like a warm embrace, quieting the doubts that had long plagued me. I began to realize that I didn't have to change who I was to be part of her world. All I had to do was show up, to let myself be swept into the storm, and trust that I would find my footing along the way. For a while, it felt like we were invincible. Two opposing forces that somehow fit perfectly together. Her energy, her spontaneity, her zest for life. It pulled me out of the safe shell I had built for myself and into a world that felt fuller, brighter. But even storms aren't endless, and the cracks in our seemingly perfect connection began to show. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just small moments that hinted at deeper fears and insecurities we both carried. She had a habit of disappearing when things got too serious, retreating into herself in a way that left me questioning if I had done something wrong. I, on the other hand, found myself holding back, afraid to fully express what I was feeling. One evening, after a particularly wonderful day, the air between us shifted. We were sitting in her apartment, the remnants of takeout containers spread across the coffee table. She seemed quieter than usual, her gaze distant. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to read her expression. She hesitated, the playful confidence I'd come to know replaced by something softer, more uncertain. "Do you ever feel like this, whatever this is too good to be true?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words hit me like a wave, stirring up every insecurity I had buried. I didn't know how to respond because in some ways I had been thinking the same thing. Could something so powerful, so intense, really last? Instead of reassuring her, I froze. The fear of saying the wrong thing kept me silent, and in that silence I saw her walls go up. She smiled faintly, brushing off her own question with a forced laugh. "Never mind," she said, standing to clear the table. But I couldn't let it go. Her words lingered in my mind, amplifying my own doubts. Over the next few days we grew distant, not intentionally, but in the way people do when they're both afraid of addressing what's really wrong. Our conversations became shorter, less frequent. The effortless connection we had felt heavy, strained. The turning point came during a small argument, one that started over something trivial, but quickly escalated into something bigger. "Why do you keep pulling away?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked at me, her expression a mix of frustration and sadness. "Why do you always wait for me to make the first move?" Her question struck a nerve because it was true. I had spent so much time trying to follow her lead, afraid that my own vulnerability would be too much, that I had forgotten how to meet her halfway. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I don't know how to keep up with you, how to be enough for you." Her expression softened, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of our unspoken fears hanging in the air. "You don't have to keep up," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking you to be here, to show me that this matters to you as much as it does to me." Her words were a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of my own doubts. For the first time, I realized that the storm she had brought into my life wasn't something I needed to weather alone. It was something we could face together. But first I had to let go of my fear. Her words lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. "I'm just asking you to be here." They were simple, but they carried the weight of a truth I had been avoiding. I realized that in trying to keep up with her, in fearing I wasn't enough, I had been holding back the one thing she needed most, my presence, unguarded and real. The turning point came on a rainy Saturday. She had invited me to join her for a walk. Yes, in the rain. It was such a her thing to do, and every logical part of me wanted to say no. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of her eyes that night, vulnerable and searching. Or maybe it was my own quiet resolve to meet her halfway. When I showed up at the park, the rain was a light drizzle, enough to dampen my clothes but not my determination. She was already there, her jacket hood pulled up, droplets clinging to her lashes. When she saw me, her face lit up in that way that always made my breath catch. "You came," she said, as though she hadn't been sure I would. I nodded, the corners of my lips tugging into a small smile. "You asked me to be here," I said simply. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, as if deciding words weren't enough, she reached for my hand. Her fingers were cold but steady, and I felt something shift between us, a silent acknowledgement that this was our beginning, not our end. We walked in silence for a while, the rain falling softly around us. It felt like the world had faded away, leaving only the two of us and the steady rhythm of our footsteps. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm not always good at this," she admitted, her voice quiet, "at letting people in." Her words caught me off guard, not because they surprised me, but because of the courage it must have taken for her to say them. "I'm not either," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "But I'm trying." and I don't want to stop trying." She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine. Whatever she saw seemed to reassure her because she smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "That's all I've ever wanted," she said. That day became a turning point for us. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic confession, but it was enough. It was two people choosing, in the midst of their fears and uncertainties, to keep showing up for each other. After that, things began to shift. Our silences no longer felt heavy, and our conversations were tinged with a deeper honesty. I stopped waiting for her to lead and started taking steps of my own. Small ones at first, like calling her just to hear her voice or planning a surprise day trip to a place she'd mentioned loving. She in turn let me see the parts of herself she usually kept hidden, the doubts, the insecurities, the moments when her energy dimmed and she needed someone to hold her steady. We didn't fix each other, but we grew together, finding strength in the spaces we had once feared to tread. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just part of her world. I was part of our world, a place we were building together. And as the storm inside me settled into something new, not calm but balance, I realized that I didn't just love her for the whirlwind she brought into my life. I loved her because she had shown me that even in the chaos, there was something worth holding on to. It happened one evening in the most ordinary of ways, but it felt monumental. We were sitting on my apartment floor, sharing takeout and laughter, surrounded by the kind of quiet intimacy that only comes from truly knowing someone. She had her feet tucked under her, her hands gesturing animatedly as she told a story about a road trip she'd taken years ago. I wasn't really listening to the details. I was too focused on her, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke, the way her laugh came so easily, the way she seemed completely at home in my space. And then, just as quickly as the thought came, it spilled out of my mouth before I could stop it. "I love you." The words hung in the air between us, fragile yet electric. Her story halted mid-sentence, her expression shifting from surprise to something I couldn't quite place. For a moment I panicked. Had I said it too soon? Was she ready to hear it? She set her takeout box down, her hands trembling slightly. What?" she asked, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "I love you," I said again, this time steadier. "I didn't plan to say it tonight, or maybe even this soon, but it's true. You've changed everything for me, and I don't want to hold back anymore." Her eyes softened, and for a moment I thought she might cry. Then, just as suddenly as my confession, she laughed, a breathy, nervous sound that made my chest tighten. "I'm not laughing at you," she said quickly, seeing the look on my face. "It's just, I've wanted to say it too, for weeks now, but I was too scared." Relief crashed over me like a wave, and before I could think, I reached for her hand. "You don't have to be scared," I said, my voice firm. "Not with me." She smiled then, a slow, radiant smile that felt like the sun breaking through clouds. "I love you too," she said softly. Hearing those words was like finally finding the missing piece to a puzzle I hadn't realized I'd been trying to solve. In that moment, everything felt right, not perfect, but real in a way that mattered. That night, as we sat together in the quiet glow of my living room, it hit me how far we'd come. We had weathered doubts and fears, learned to trust and let go, and now, here we were, choosing each other with open hearts. It wasn't the end of our journey, far from it, but it was the moment that solidified everything we'd been building together. It was the calm after the storm, and for the first time, I realized I didn't fear the quiet anymore. From that night on, everything felt different, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, steady way that love settles into your life. We had said the words, and now they hung between us like a promise, unspoken but deeply felt. Loving her wasn't easy, but it wasn't supposed to be. She still had her storms, moments when her fears crept back in, when she doubted her place in my life or her own worth. And I had my own moments of hesitation, times when my need for stability clashed with her craving for spontaneity. But what mattered was that we faced those moments together. Each time we chose each other again. Each time we let the love we had built remind us that even the fiercest storms could lead to something beautiful. One day, as we walked through the park, she paused mid-step and turned to me. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice soft but uncertain. "Regret what?" I asked, confused. "Letting me in," she said, her eyes searching mine. I know I'm not the easiest person to love. I took her hands in mine, anchoring her to the moment. You're wrong, I said firmly. You are the easiest person to love. You make everything else in life feel complicated by comparison. She smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion, and for a moment neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. As the seasons changed, so did we. We learned to grow together, to embrace the chaos and the calm in equal measure. She showed me how to let go of my need for control, and I taught her the value of stillness, of finding peace in the present. Looking back now, I can see that she didn't just change my life. She transformed it. She came in like a storm, tearing down walls I didn't know I'd built and scattering the pieces of my carefully crafted existence. And in the space she created, we built something new, something wild and imperfect and entirely ours. I used to think that love was about finding someone who fit neatly into your life, someone who made everything easy. But now I know the truth. Love isn't about ease. It's about choosing someone every day, even when it's hard. It's about weathering the storms together and finding beauty in the mess. And as I sit here now, watching her laugh at some joke I've already forgotten, I realize I never want the calm again. Because the storm she brought into my life wasn't something to fear. It was something to cherish.